Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon, and welcome to the Post 96, How to Examine a PhD Through an Oral Examination, with a big shout out to Doug. Hi Doug. And this post this week is a tag team wrestling partner with the gig we did last week. Last week we investigated how to examine a PhD, that preliminary report, the reading. So we explored how you read a PhD, how you write your report, and also how you summon a grade. But in almost all systems around the world, that first stage, reading the thesis and writing a report, that's the preliminary examination. And we're about to go into the second stage, and in some ways the confirming, the research integrity confirmation stage. The problem that we have is that Australia is an outlier to international examination protocols, and as an Australian I would like to apologise on behalf of my people. Still, unbelievably, only 1/3 of Australian universities have an oral examination for a PhD. And can I say, as someone who's examined for many of those third of the universities that do have an oral examination, the processes themselves are unbelievably poor. And I get cross about this, as you can hear, angry, stroppy Tara. I get stroppy about this because Australia came late to oral examination. So there's no excuses here. We can survey the world, great SOS, great scholarship of supervision, great theories of doctoral studies, and we can survey the world and pick the best policies and procedures to enact our oral examination. But no. And that makes me stroppy, but I just can't believe the state of what's happened in Australian doctoral education at the moment. It's almost as if we actively chose to pick the worst bits of examination components and systems around the world. So this post commences with an apology to my international colleagues. I expect more of Australian higher education, and when you get the opportunity to examine in Australia, please take that opportunity and train our colleagues on the job. Ta. And can I say also, I'm currently living in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and can I say Aotearoa, New Zealand is not much better either. There are 8 universities, little country, 8 universities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and all of them do have an oral examination. But once more, Aotearoa, New Zealand came late to the oral examination protocol. They could have learnt about international best practice and deploy the best components of examination around the world, and once more they have deployed the worst. It's like this part of the world is cosplaying at PhD examination. The makeup's cracking a bit, the AA batteries and the lightsaber, oh no, they're going, and everything's just a bit pathetic, a bit embarrassing, a bit naff. But it doesn't have to be this way. So colleagues, let's talk about the international protocols for oral examination from the perspective of the examiner. Remember, this double post is about you, wherever you are on your journey, our most senior colleagues, hello crew, to our very, very junior ECR crew about to go into their first examination. This is about us talking through the methodology of how to examine a PhD. And even with inelegant policies, pretty dodgy governance, really weird stuff happening, we can make a decision to be ethical, rigorous, and appropriate, and yes, professional. So this post, like the last one, has 2 parts. Firstly, I'm going to start with introducing the cast of characters that exist in the oral examination, and that's always very interesting. And then the second half, I'm going to present the genres of questions that you can ask in an oral examination, so that you have that preparation. You can completely ignore me, but if you want to have a look at how the questions are segmented through an oral exam, we're going to do that together. So let's start very excitingly with the roles, the characters that exist in oral examinations around the world. Now, all universities have some of these roles, and some universities have all of these roles. The cast of characters obviously starts with the student All of this exists for you. So it is about ensuring the student is comfortable, the student is treated professionally, but we are able to assess research, academic integrity protocols from the student. But also, besides the student, we have an independent chair, external examiner or examiners, internal examiner or examiners, and in some nations, wonderfully, we have an audience for the oral examination. We'll talk about that, a public defence shortly, and also supervisors can often be in the examination process in some form. We'll get to that in a second. So the independent chair is great and important. They are appointed from within the university, but often outside of the department or the school or the faculty of the student or the supervisor advisor. Their role is crucial, increasingly so. Their role is to ensure that the policies and the procedures, the governance protocols of the university are in place through the oral examination. They offer advice on those policies to the examiners if required, and really they have to be asked questions. They're there to construct the framework so the examiners, the external examiners, can do their job. What happens is they meet with the examiners 30 minutes or so before the oral examination commences. That is, the students brought in, and they are there to talk about process and structures and behaviours as required. So that's all the procedural governance stuff, very important. But they do have a second role, the independent chair. And most of you know who have worked with me, I have an iPad. And most of us, when we're doing an independent chair, we have the iPad up or we have notes up and we log times, the time through the oral examination and what's happening. So we provide a descriptive account of the processes of the oral exam. We are a witness to the oral examination. And we're doing that for many reasons, to ensure that the policies and procedures are cared for and respected, but we're also making sure that the student has a fair go. We are a witness to make sure that they are respected. And if something goes wrong, and occasionally that does happen, the independent chair has the capacity and the right to intervene and indeed shut the oral examination down. And that can often happen, no, doesn't often happen, it rarely happens, but it happens often when one external examiner goes rogue and starts bullying, abuse, name calling and so forth. Very interesting protocols, but that's why the independent chair needs to be there. And also they're able to manage any challenges that emerge. So say with technology, if they are aware the student has an impairment, a disability or a matter that needs to be disclosed in terms of reasonable modifications to the examiners, the independent chair carries that information. But it is important to remember that, occasionally an examiner does go rogue, does go feral, and the independent chair exists to step in as required. The role of the independent chair is as the guardian of standards. They're representing their institution and their nation state, but it's also about international respect as well. Now, the independent chair is not there, this is important, not there to influence the examiners, to ask questions or to impact on the result in any way. Independent chairs are important and oral examinations are better if they are present. But let's move to the other roles. Now, the most important person in this story, except for the student, is obviously the external examiner or examiners. Most systems around the world have two external examiners. Both are equal in status and they have a role and a place in creating the final result for the student. They're both involved. Now, these people must be international experts in the field of the thesis. They should be internationally sourced, and far too often, we have this weird nationalism that exists in PhD examinations. So British examiners examine a British student, Canadian examiners examine a Canadian student. Now, thankfully, COVID did do a very interesting intervention in that, and Zoom was trialled. And so it demonstrated very clearly that PhD examination is an international protocol, and it's very easy and very straightforward to source international examiners. So they are brought into the process as experts to assess the student. Now what happens is they both independently read the thesis. What we talked about last week. They both independently read the thesis, they both independently write a report, they both independently configure what's called a preliminary grade. Okay, and by the way, if the thesis is problematic, so as we talked about last week, if the thesis is below the line, so it's a problematic thesis, almost always around the world, that thesis and the student is not permitted to progress to the oral examination because the thesis is not good enough. They're not going to pass. Why put the student through that trauma? So they're sent away with the reports and they revise the thesis to go again another time. Okay, so that's for the below the line, but that's a minority of theses. Okay, so these external examiners have assessed the thesis independently and returned their reports to the graduate centre or graduate office. Then the wonderful professional staff and examination officers, they accept those reports and they send them to each other. So examiner receives the other examiner's report and grading. So going into the oral examination, both external examiners have read the other person's report. Always interesting. And so they meet, and often you have no idea who this person is except by reputation. And so these two examiners meet 30 minutes before the oral examination, and they get to know each other. They work out the ordering of questions, often what's called a deal breaker. So we work out, do either of the examiners have one issue that concerns them deeply and they can't pass the thesis without having that matter resolved. So all this stuff is discussed and both examiners get on the same page to configure a professional front stage for the student, right? All of that is about the student and about the student reaching standards. So they get together, it's all good. Now, if the student has issues, so this does happen, say a student has had a very serious illness, is returning from a cancer diagnosis, all of this happens. The independent chair informs the examiners and they are able to come up with reasonable modifications for that student. So it could be sectioning the questions with the most important questions early on and giving the students breaks every 30 minutes, that's absolutely an option. And it's also caring for the student so they know that if a technological problem happens, that there's a plan B and C and D. So all of the external examiner stuff is done, 30 minutes, in, out, shake it all about. The student is then invited into the Zoom call or the Teams call, or they're welcomed into the room. And the student answers questions from the external examiners for 90 minutes to 2 hours. Now, the oral examinations can be a bit shorter, not by much, and in some national systems, it's much longer. And the student, after they've done that 90 minutes, 2 hours of questions, the student then leaves the room or the Zoom call, and the external examiners with the independent chair offers no intellectual commentary, but the external examiners get together and work out if the student has reached the threshold to pass. And then after they've come up with their determination, the student is invited back in and informed about the result. Okay, so we have the external examiners, crucial, brilliant, important. Now, in many systems, and I would argue I'm very comfortable with this, in many systems, probably I would say the best systems, that's the protocol. We've got the student, we've got the independent chair, we've got two external examiners, thanks. But now we're getting into the variations. Some nations, often British nations and their colonised nation states, have and made a decision to have an independent chair, an external examiner, and an internal examiner. Yeah, right. So there is an external examiner, a person who is outside the university of the student and the supervisor advisor, and there's one supervisor that's from the institution. Now, for me, this is absolute madness. Now, I could understand the argument in the old days, 15 years ago, when there wasn't an independent chair. So there was an internal examiner to help the external examiner with the bespoke policies, procedures, governance protocols of that institution. But that role is no longer required. Internal examiners should not exist. And let me tell you why, and you can disagree with me, but let's litigate the argument. A university has 2 supervisors or advisors for a student. They are the institutional experts in that field. That's why they're the supervisors, advisors. They may be international scholars of great note in that area. They may be nationally important, but at its most basic, they are the 2 institutional subject experts in that field. Cool. Why would you therefore deploy the 3rd expert in an institution who wasn't good enough on that subject to be a supervisor? Nightmare. Ridiculous. So for me, this is just not justifiable. And can I say, there are thousands of universities around the world using this system. So have a think about it. For me, it's crazy because there's a big world out there. There are thousands of incredible international experts in that field. Why wouldn't you be using them? And it is important, and this is implicit knowledge. This is assumptions that examiners never talk about. But it's implicit, isn't it, colleagues, that if you are the internal examiner on a thesis, that the external examiner's views are the most important. So if you disagree, nobody cares terribly much. The internal examiner must bow to the expertise of the external. So let's follow the argument through. Therefore, why is the internal there? The external is more important than the internal, and that's why I would argue it's very useful to have 2 external examiners with equal weight and importance so they can configure a consensus. And can I say that also protects the student? You've got 2 experts and they must agree. Okay, so one examiner being a bullying, aggressive, terrible person is held in check by a second one. Okay, so that's the cast of characters in the oral examination. Some other national systems have other moving parts. The supervisor can be present in the oral examination, and from my perspective, that's absolutely fine. That's great. They can sit in the back of the oral examination or be in the Zoom call, but have no role in it. So they're there to support the student physically and also take notes, because of course the student is very, very stressed, and a supervisor can take notes through the examination process to speed up any corrections. I think all of that's great. The problem is in some North American examination systems, the supervisors have a very, very active role asking questions as part of the examination panel. And again, for me, this is a mistake. And again, let me just present the argument. You can disagree with me. Supervisors, advisors have had 3, 4, 5, 6 years to ask their questions. 3, 4, 5, 6 years to offer their commentary about the thesis. Supervision is different from formal examination. And can I say, when the supervisors are involved as supposedly equal members of an oral examination panel, some very strange stuff happens because they're too invested, to be frank. They're too invested in the emotion of it rather than actually making this a proper governance protocol. And I'll give you one Canadian example because I was in it. There were 2 external examiners. I was one of them, and we had a remarkable senior colleague, senior professor from Nigeria. Remarkable woman. We are not worthy. It was an absolute privilege to be examining with her. And okay, so we'd asked the questions and the student was asked to leave, and we're having the discussion about how we're going to rank and evaluate this student. And a supervisor, advisor, interrupted this process 20 seconds in before we could even begin our discussion. And he said, "This is a great thesis. Let's not waste anybody's time. Let's pass this straight through." He spoke over our colleague from Nigeria. The chair didn't intervene. It was astonishing, and so I had to live the stereotype of my people and be the stroppy Australian and say, everybody, can we just stop for one moment, please? Our colleague from Nigeria would like to speak, and I would like to hear what she has to say. And can I say, I mean, it was just a bonkers examination event. This supervisor, advisor through the process also decided to read a poem through the examination process. So this is bonkers, right? And in British systems, the supervisor can sit at the back and remain silent, and I remain absolutely supportive of that system. But anything that stops external examiners from doing their job, it has to go bye-byes. Now, there are some fabulous national differences in this pretty straightforward standard model, and you knew we'd go to the Scandinavian countries. You knew I would go to Finland. And, you know, the Finnish example is famous around the world quite rightly because of the public defence and the fabulous fashion. But can I also say what people forget about the Finnish system, and we need to remember, is that their first stage, their preliminary investigation stage and examination stage, is really, really robust. I'm very impressed by it. And in fact, to be frank, the Finnish first stage, the preliminary examination, is a better examination than most nations around the world. And what I love about that first preliminary written stage in Finland is they're arguing for consensus. So they want to make sure everybody has litigated their arguments, spoken the words, talked about it. The colleagues have got a good sense of consensus about what they think about the thesis, the research and everything before it progresses. And I always remember with the Finnish system, there's this moment where everybody has to sign off that they are satisfied that it's of standard to progress. So it's very professional, very, very strong. So it has this very strict first stage that people very rarely talk about. And yes, of course, in Finland and in many other nations, there is a public defence. It's very formal. There are dress codes, and the candidate delivers a 20-minute presentation. It exists in some of the North American systems too, whereby, and I'm not a huge fan of this, but so the student comes and delivers a 20-minute presentation. Dude, we've just read 400 pages, but still talk to the hand, delivers a 20-minute presentation, and then questions are asked. And in the Finnish system, they are an opponent or opponents. And they present a commentary and they ask robust questions. Okay. And the PhD student must defend their work. It is a proper defence. And then, of course, the Finnish system continues. There is a public section where people come along, members of the public, and offer comments and questions. So it's like, Brian, do you feel like going to an oral exam today? Yeah, Phyllis, let's go to an oral exam, eh? And so people just rock up, and how fantastic is that? Now, this process, of course, therefore in Finland, goes for some hours. It's much longer than the other systems around the world. And the thesis is assessed on its scholarly merits, its research contribution, but also the capacity of the student to defend their work. Okay. Now, while the public component for this system is wonderful and fantastic and we all love it, can I say we've always got to remember that a doctorate must be determined by international standards of scholarship as configured by experts in the field. So it's wonderful if Phyllis and Brian ask questions of a student. That's great. That's wonderful. It's a public university. That's great. But can I say that's not about passing and failing the thesis. It must be assessed at international scholarly standards. And famously, of course, the degree is conferred with a big public event involving a fantastic hat and a sword. Yes. So you've got all the roles and participants that exist in an oral examination. As you can see, there are many working parts, but no matter what form or what structure, the point of an oral exam, there are really 5. What are we doing here? There are 5 things we're looking for. Firstly, the most important is we are confirming research integrity. Did this human write this work? 2, we're assessing if the student has the communication skills to speak to their research. Thirdly, and this is actually quite important, we're addressing the queries or concerns from examiners with regard to structure, methodology, epistemology, ontology. Putting it in my language, are there deal breakers? So is there something in chapter 3 that is worrying an examiner, and that matter has to be discharged? Okay. 4, test alternative methods or strategies. And 5, provide trajectories for future work. All of that's great. Of course, the most important are the 1, 2, 3. The other 2 components are nice and great for the student, but we're about research integrity here. So we ask the questions to ensure that the student whose name is on the cover page and who is going to get this degree actually wrote it. We have to verify authorship. And this is crucial, and we have to ask enough questions so we are comfortable that the student has done this work. And you see, at the end of the oral examination, there must be no doubt that it is the student's work. Remember, in the written process, you need to get all the information you require. So it might be an authenticate report, it might be Turnitin, text matching, and of course we've all got access to magical interfaces to do our own work as well, but you need the data sets to be able to make that determination. And yes, with AI, generative AI, shortcuts are not welcomed in the doctoral process. Now, I've got a lot more to say about this, and I know a lot of you wonderfully are asking me questions, all our comments on our channel, Taro, can you talk about it? And colleagues, I will. I've been working in educational technology for 27 years. I wrote Digital Hemlock. I wrote the University of Google. Those cliches are titles of my books, okay? But there's a bunch of randoms at the moment that are doing this. Right? Oh, it's new. Oh, it's exciting, right? And I'm not one of those people. So I made a deal with myself on your behalf that I would do 20 courses around the world on generative AI. 20 courses before I speak. Now, I'm nearing the end of that cycle, but I wanted to have a strong sense and a mature sense of the impact of generative AI on doctoral education. Now, you very rarely hear this being talked about. And think about it, we've now got underprepared undergraduate students coming into a doctoral program, and I'm just starting to see policies and procedures and governance that's saying, oh, if students have used generative AI, they need to declare it in the thesis. Is the doctoral space a space of shortcuts, is it? We'll return to this later. Shortcuts, when they're taken with research, must be revealed in the oral examination. So what is crucial is the student is demonstrating their research training, the capacity to read, to write, to conduct literature reviews, to configure a gap, and to put research in that gap. Thanks for playing. They need to confirm the capacity that they have written their own research, and they're able to ask questions about it, and they're able to talk about epistemological and methodological alternatives to what they've done. So what an oral exam does is we need to look a student in the eye, and we need to ask a question, and they need to answer it in real time. So I'll finish off this post by just giving you the genre, the structure of oral examination questions for your consideration. So if you're about to go into one and you're writing up the questions, have a think about this as a shape for you. Okay. Now, I go into every single oral examination with prepared questions. I have an opening question, I have a closing question, I have 8 in the middle. So I go in with 10 questions to ask, and I have the most important questions at the start, because obviously what you've got to do through that 30-minute conversation with the other external examiner is you have to mesh the 2 sets of questions. Okay, so that's what you're doing in that 30 minutes, making sure that everything is covered so you can both make a determination. So depending on the other examiner, I get through most of my 10 questions. I certainly get to 7, I often get to 8. But you see, I don't wing it. This is not about a vibe. This is not a US conference presentation, right, where some random gets up in a suit and goes, haven't really got a question, more of a comment. A PhD oral examination is not a place for comments. We are assessing research integrity. Sort yourself out. This is a formal process to determine whether this thesis is of quality and that student wrote that thesis. It's not about you as an examiner. All of this is about two things: the student and international standards, full stop. So I'll give you the shape and see if this is helpful. And remember, it must mesh with colleague or colleagues. The best chairs, and the independent chair role is crucial. They're able to mesh with professionalism the two sets of questions, and that 30 minutes before the student arrives is absolutely crucial. Everything has to be done there. It's a very busy, stressful time, so be aware of that. So by the time the student comes in, it looks very calm. Okay. So we start with the introduction and the introductory questions. These are obviously often handball questions. You welcome the student and you ask a couple of relatively straightforward questions to orient them into the space. Can I say it's also beneficial at the start to explain the shape of what's going to be happening. So welcome the student to the space and do all sorts of caveats like, look, if anything goes wrong with the technology, don't sweat it. Here's the plan B, C and D, not a concern. If you need to take a break, that's cool, please ask for it. If you don't, we'll have breaks at these particular periods if you so choose. And if you've got a student with health concerns, impairment, disability or neurodivergence in a way that is declared, then talking through the shape, this is the shape of how this will look, makes a huge difference. I also do one other thing. I say to the students, if you start answering a question and you realize you've gone down the wrong rabbit hole, that's cool. Just say, could I start answering that question again? So you're giving the student the second and third chance. There's no deal breakers here. All of this is about the student being at their best and revealing their best selves through examination. Okay, so after these comments orienting the human into the space, the introductory questions can look something like, what brought you to this research area and this research focus? Looking back on your thesis now, what do you believe is the major contribution of your research? Or how would you describe the value of this research to a colleague in the profession? That works quite well for allied health, for education as well. So from the introductory handball questions, I move into the disciplinary questions. Who are the main scholars in the field? The one I often ask is, which scholar do you admire and they had a transformative role in this thesis? If the thesis is interdisciplinary, don't let that word pass without some interrogation. So, okay, it's interdisciplinary. What does that mean? How are you applying it? How are you bringing the disciplines together? Ask that question. But also be more critical here. So occasionally, and wow, I hope this stops, occasionally students make a declarative statement like, as a post-structuralist, or this thesis has a post-structuralist inflection. Well, ask them about the 2 or 3 post-structuralist theorists that most impacted on their work. And yes, this has happened. I have done this, and the student could not list a single post-structuralist scholar, even though they stated in the thesis that it was a post-structuralist research project. So what you're doing with these disciplinary questions is you're seeing if the student has read enough. So if they've read enough to locate a legitimate gap in scholarship, or they just simply haven't read enough, so they think everybody else is pretty stupid and they've discovered something that actually was discovered 45 years ago. Okay, so we're trying to see if there's a legitimate gap and they've read enough. The next set of questions are often the methodological questions. We've got to really work through and again investigate the diversity of methodologies. Don't allow the qual, quant, mixed method, allow these cliches to proliferate. Start to question them, what do they mean? And I ask questions like, what did your selection of methods mean what you didn't discover? So how did your selection of methods restrict the data sets that you gathered? What data sets were not possible to collect through your selection of methods? Okay, so with methodological questions, always block the easy, default, or simple answers of qual, quant, mixed. Surveys, interviews, yawn, yawn, yawn. I need you to litigate them. I need you to evaluate and question what the student has blocked. So by going through those methodologies, ask them, what other methodologies were available? Why did you not make that selection? And if you did, how would data sets have been differently constituted? Okay, so that's the methodology question, thinking about alternatives. Okay, we're now at the core of the oral examination. This is the research integrity verification. So, did the student write the work that we're evaluating? Yes, it's about authorship. Yes, it's about generative AI. This is crucial. And this will be an expanding area of the oral examination. Now, 5 years ago, in fact, even 3 years ago, I would ask about 3 granular questions. I think now we need to get to about 5 and perhaps more. So these granular questions involve asking stuff like, on page 153 of your thesis, you cited John Brown in his evaluation of Smith Enterprises. Could you confirm Brown's wider historical context for his analysis and what alternative interpretations would be available now? Or, on page 245, you presented a bracketed reference to Ralph 2021. I can't see the relationship between what you stated in that paragraph and Ralph's analysis. Could you explain to us the connection between your paragraph and that reference? Or, in your reference list on page 410, you confirmed that you've read Sally et al. 2023, their article. Could you tell us about the methodology that Sally et al. Used, and again, what alternatives they dismissed and why they dismissed them? Now, these are tough questions, I know that. They're really tough, but they are necessary because we need to confirm if the student has done the work. Remember, phantom references are a characteristic of generative AI. The interfaces make stuff up. Now, through our written process, remember, we've checked every reference, we've checked every quotation, we know what's real and what's not because we've checked it. So at this point, we ask those questions. So to give you an example, I examined a very, very weak PhD. It's in the 3 or 4 worst theses of the hundreds I've examined. And it was really a master's, and it was really a poor master's, to be frank. And when I was reading the reference list, I saw that there was a reference in her list that she couldn't have read. It was a report from ministerial eyes only. So she couldn't have had access to it. So in the oral exam, I asked her about this reference and I said, how did you get access to it? And she started to cry and said, I haven't had access to it, I haven't read it. So of course that's proven stuff in her reference list that she hadn't read. Okay. But also you see these sort of questions are about a research integrity verification. We need to go deeply into the publications, into the thesis, to see that the student knows enough about those publications as an author that they actually know what's going on in terms of content. We have to ask direct questions about those publications and be sure that the student has done enough work in those co-authored pieces so they're going to get credit for it in a doctorate. So in the oral examination, that is where we make these determinations. And I'll quote a wonderful old Yorkshire professor, he was a legend, who was asking really tough questions in an oral examination. I was the independent chair. And he used this great transitional line, quote, "We're going to move to the part of the oral examination now where we talk about your publications and why I disagree with your peer reviewers. What a legend. What a legend he was. So these granular questions are absolutely crucial, and they are proxies for authorship, academic integrity, and research integrity. So the final questions, the nice ones, relaxed ending, where we talk about research trajectories and what could have been done differently. I always ask the question, like, if you were starting this thesis again, what would you have done differently? Great question. And the students I really worry about are the ones that go, I would change nothing. I would change nothing. I would change nothing. I'm brilliant. My thesis is brilliant, 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 brilliant. I would change nothing. Wrong. All research has sliding doors. All research has alternative pathways we could have taken. So the great question like that, what would you have done differently? That's not only about research integrity, that's about intellectual ability. The final question I ask about dissemination, the trajectories of the research, and the reason I do that is a student may only have 2 supervisors in their career, but they'll also only have 2 or 3 examiners in their career, and examiners are very useful to students, particularly with regard to research dissemination and publications. So we all need to know that the PhD examination is crucial work. In fact, to be frank, there's probably no more important job we have in international higher education than examining doctorates. This process matters, and you matter doing it. I wish you love, light, and peace. Good on you, Doug. Tea out.